A 26-year-old woman walked onto the most famous talk show stage in America and said something so unexpected, so raw, so completely unscripted that Johnny Carson, the man who had kept his composure through 30 years of live television, visibly flinched, not from her words, from the truth hiding behind them. What Carrie Fisher whispered to Johnny Carson during the commercial break on July 29, 1983 has never been fully told. The cameras caught everything, the laughter, the brilliance, the bravado, but they missed the moment that mattered most. The moment when the Princess of the Galaxy and the King of Late Night sat in the dark of a commercial break and one of them told the truth for the very first time. What did she say? Why did Johnny Carson spend the next 20 years thinking about that night? And why did Carrie Fisher later say that conversation changed the entire direction of her life? Stay with me, because this story begins and ends in the same place, with a young woman who was magnificent on the outside and quietly drowning on the inside, and a man who saw through every single layer of the performance. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. She walked out from behind that curtain like she owned the building. July 29, 1983, the NBC studios in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. 300 people in the audience, 40 million more watching from their living rooms, and a young woman in a white dress with dark eyes that held something most people in that room couldn't quite name. Carrie Fisher was 26 years old. She was the most recognizable face on Earth. 4 years earlier, she had become Princess Leia, warrior, icon, the face of a generation's dreams. She had just reprised that role in Return of the Jedi, which had shattered every box office record imaginable. She was the biggest star in the world, and she was falling apart in ways nobody in that room could see. Johnny Carson stood from behind his desk as she came through the curtain, something he did not always do for every guest. The audience erupted. Doc Severinsen's band played something sweeping and cinematic. Carrie smiled that million-dollar smile, waved to the crowd like she'd been doing it her whole life, which in some ways she had. She sat down across from Johnny. She crossed her legs. She picked up her glass of water with a hand that nobody noticed was trembling. Johnny leaned forward with that famous grin. "So how does it feel to save the galaxy again?" Carrie Fisher looked directly into his eyes and said something that made the studio audience roar with laughter. But what she said next, just after the laughter died, was quiet enough that only Johnny could hear it. And what Johnny heard changed something in him, because what she said wasn't funny at all. It was the truest thing she'd said in years. But before we get to what she whispered, you need to understand what July 29, 1983 really was for Carrie Fisher. Because it was not a triumphant night, not for her, not underneath the performance that she had been giving the entire world since she was 19 years old. What was really happening inside that dressing room before she walked onto that stage will break your heart. Carrie Frances Fisher had been famous since before she understood what famous meant. Her mother was Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart, the girl who sang in the rain, the woman who had survived one of Hollywood's most public betrayals when Eddie Fisher left her for Elizabeth Taylor. Her father was Eddie Fisher, charming, brilliant, self-destructive, largely absent. Carrie grew up in the eye of Hollywood's original tabloid storm before she could read a tabloid. She had been performing her entire life, not because she chose it, because it was the air in the room. She enrolled at London's Central School of Speech and Drama at 17. At 19, she was cast in Shampoo alongside Warren Beatty. At 19, she auditioned for a strange science fiction film that nobody thought would amount to much. George Lucas told her she was too short to be a princess. She told him she was the right size for a revolution. She got the role. Star Wars changed everything, not just cinema, not just culture. Everything for Carrie Fisher personally. One day she was a teenager trying to figure out who she was. The next day she was Princess Leia, and the world decided that Carrie Fisher and Princess Leia were the same person. The world was wrong, but Carrie Fisher was too young and too overwhelmed to correct them. By the time the cameras rolled on July 29, 1983, she had been Princess Leia for 6 years. She had just spent months filming Return of the Jedi in a metal bikini in the California desert, shooting scenes that would become the most discussed images of her career, images that she herself would later describe with a complicated mixture of pride and exhaustion. What nobody in that Tonight Show audience knew was what those 6 years had cost her. Here is what was really happening behind that smile, behind that wit, behind the brilliance that left every interviewer scrambling to keep up. What Carrie Fisher was carrying into that studio on July 29, 1983, nobody knew, nobody asked, and she had gotten so good at hiding it that even the people closest to her had stopped looking. But Johnny Carson was not like other people, and what he saw the moment she sat down across from him was not a movie star at the peak of her powers. It was something else entirely. The Tonight Show had a green room that smelled of coffee and hairspray, and the nervous energy of people trying to be their best selves. Carrie Fisher arrived at NBC Studios at 4:30 in the afternoon. Her hair was perfect, her dress was perfect, her answers were already prepared, the funny ones, the self-deprecating ones, the clever deflections that had made her one of the most entertaining interview subjects in Hollywood. She had been doing this for years. The performance began not when the cameras rolled, but the moment she stepped out of the car. Her publicist accompanied her to the green room and ran through the talking points. Return of the Jedi was the story of the summer. The numbers were staggering. The film had already grossed over $200 million. Everyone wanted a piece of Carrie Fisher in the summer of 1983. What her publicist did not know was that Carrie had barely slept in 3 days. What her publicist did not know was that she had been using recreational drugs since the filming of The Empire Strikes Back, and that in the summer of 1983, that use had escalated into something she was no longer entirely in control of. What nobody in that green room knew was that Carrie Fisher was 26 years old. She was the most famous young woman in the world, and she was profoundly, quietly, desperately lonely. She sat alone for 12 minutes before the segment. She stared at her own reflection in the makeup mirror. She watched a version of herself that she had constructed so carefully it had become almost indistinguishable from the real thing. She picked up a pen. She wrote 2 words on a cocktail napkin. She stared at them. Then she folded the napkin and put it in the small pocket of her dress. Those 2 words would matter before the night was over. When Ed McMahon's voice boomed across that studio and the audience rose for Carrie Fisher, something happened that the cameras almost missed. Johnny Carson, watching from behind his desk, noticed something in how she walked. Not the confidence, not the smile. Something underneath both of those things. Something he recognized because he had worn that same expression himself, on nights that he never talked about publicly. He made a decision before she even reached the guest chair. Tonight he was going to do something different. At exactly 6:14 in the evening, Carrie Fisher walked through the Tonight Show curtain for the second time in her career. The first time had been in 1977, a nervous 19-year-old promoting a movie nobody was sure would succeed. Tonight was different. Tonight she arrived as a conqueror. The applause was enormous. 300 people on their feet. The kind of welcome that usually belonged to sitting presidents or legendary musicians. Johnny stood, which he did selectively and purposefully, and that gesture alone told the audience, this woman matters. She sat. She smiled. She was magnificent. For the first 7 minutes, the interview was everything the producers had planned. Carrie was electric, sharp-tongued, self-deprecating, funnier than most professional comedians. She talked about the metal bikini. She described it with a deadpan precision that made the audience collapse with laughter. She did an impression of George Lucas that was affectionate and devastating in equal measure. Johnny matched her beat for beat. Their chemistry was immediate and genuine. 2 people who processed the world through wit, who used humor as both shield and sword, who recognized in each other a similar fundamental architecture of personality. But Johnny Carson had spent 30 years reading people, and at around the 7-minute mark, as Carrie Fisher delivered another perfectly timed punchline to thunderous applause, he saw something shift behind her eyes, just for a half second. Just a flicker. The kind of thing you only see when you know what to look for. Johnny had seen that flicker before. He had seen it in the eyes of comedians who were struggling with things they couldn't name. He had seen it in performers who had learned so early that laughter was their best protection that they had forgotten they were allowed to put it down. He had seen it because he had felt it himself on nights when the monologue was perfect and the audience was roaring and he walked off stage and sat alone in his dressing room and felt absolutely nothing. He decided to change directions. What he asked next was not on any producer's script, and it was about to change the entire trajectory of the night. Johnny Carson leaned back in his chair with the practiced ease of a man entirely in his element. The audience had just finished laughing at something Carrie had said about Harrison Ford's approach to acting. "You know what I've been wondering," Johnny said, his voice dropping just slightly. Not enough for the audience to notice, but enough for Carrie to feel it. "You've been Princess Leia for 6 years now. Everywhere you go, every interview, every premiere, every magazine cover. When does Carrie Fisher get to show up?" The audience laughed softly, expecting a clever reply. What they got instead was 3 seconds of silence. 3 seconds is an eternity on live television. The audience felt it. The cameras felt it. Ed McMahon, who had seen every configuration of this show for 20 years, sat up slightly straighter. Carrie Fisher looked at Johnny Carson with an expression that her face had not worn in public in a very long time. It was the expression of someone who had just been seen. "I don't know," she said quietly. Not as a joke. Not as a setup for a punchline, as an answer. "I genuinely don't know," she said again. The audience went still. What happened in the next 4 minutes of that interview has been described by 3 different crew members who were in that studio as the most honest television they ever witnessed. Not because Carrie Fisher said everything that was true, but because she said enough. Because for the first time in 6 years of public life, she stopped performing, just for a moment. Just long enough for 40 million people watching at home to see a real human being sitting in that chair instead of a carefully constructed icon. And Johnny Carson, who could have redirected, who could have made a joke to smooth it over, chose to let the silence breathe. What he said next is the reason this moment has never been forgotten. "You know," Carrie Fisher said, and she reached for her water glass without drinking from it, just held it like an anchor. "I've been thinking about that question a lot lately. Who Carrie Fisher is when you take the princess away." Johnny nodded. He did not fill the space. He waited. "My mother is Debbie Reynolds," she continued. "My father is Eddie Fisher. I was born into a story that was already being told about me. And then when I was 19, George Lucas handed me a second story. And it turns out," she paused, and the pause held something complicated and real. "It turns out that when you spend your whole life inside other people's stories, you can kind of lose track of your own." The audience was quiet in a way that was different from polite attention. This was something else. This was recognition. Johnny said, "How old were you when you first understood that?" "I think about 25, Carrie said. She almost smiled, which is when most people figure out who they are. "So I'm right on schedule, just doing it in front of a few more people than usual." The audience laughed, but softly, warmly, the way people laugh when something is funny and true at the same time. "The trouble," Carrie continued, and here her voice did something subtle, dropped half a register, lost a layer of performance. "The trouble is that when you're famous for being a character, people get confused. They think they know you. And because they think they know you, they stop asking. They already have the answer. She's the princess. She's fine. She's brave. She defeats the Empire." She set down her water glass. "And meanwhile," she said quietly, "you're sitting there thinking, I really wish someone would ask." The studio was completely still. Johnny Carson looked at Carrie Fisher for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised everyone in that control room, everyone behind those cameras, and most importantly, Carrie Fisher herself. He did not pivot back to the movie. He did not ask about the sequel. He leaned forward and he said 4 words that Carrie Fisher would carry with her for the rest of her life. 4 words she quoted in her memoir. 4 words she told interviewers about 20 years later with something in her voice that sounded like gratitude. You need to hear them. But first, what was on that napkin? The 2 words she had written alone in the green room, staring at her own reflection, because they matter more than you know. Johnny Carson leaned forward across his desk. "So I'm asking," he said. 4 words. Just 4 words, delivered without flourish, without the showman's timing he was famous for, without any of the machinery of late-night television, just one human being telling another, "I see you, I'm here, you can say it." Carrie Fisher blinked. For a moment, just a moment, the 26-year-old woman sitting in that chair looked exactly like what she was, a person who had been performing for so long that she had almost forgotten she was allowed to stop. "I've been tired," she said. It was the most honest sentence she had spoken in public in years, maybe ever. "Not physically," she added quickly. "Although yes, also physically, but more than that. Tired of," she searched for the word, and what she landed on was precise and unexpected. Tired of making the difficulty look easy. The audience understood. You could feel it, not because they were all celebrities, but because everyone in every living room watching at home had felt some version of that sentence in their own lives. Tired of making the difficulty look easy. "I think," Carrie continued, "that when you grow up in a family where everyone performs, where the performance is the love language, you learn very early that your job is to be entertaining, to be on, to fill the room." She paused, "and it takes a while to figure out that rooms don't always need to be filled." Johnny nodded slowly. "And what happens to you in the quiet ones?" Carrie Fisher smiled, and this smile was different from all the others. This one had something wistful in it, something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. "I think," she said, "I'm still figuring that out." It was at exactly this moment that the director's voice crackled through the producer's headset. "We need to go to commercial in 45 seconds. The producer started to give the signal to Johnny, but Johnny put his hand up just slightly, just enough to be seen. The gesture he used when he needed 30 more seconds. And in those 30 seconds, before the cameras cut away and America's screens filled with advertisements for cars and laundry detergent, Carrie Fisher leaned forward and said something to Johnny Carson that the microphones didn't fully catch. Something quiet, something that made Johnny Carson stop entirely and look at her with an expression his producer later described as the look he got when something really mattered. And when the cameras came back from commercial, something had changed between them, something subtle and enormous. What she said during that break is the secret this story has been building toward, and the answer has been folded in Carrie Fisher's pocket since 4:30 that afternoon. The cameras cut. The studio erupted into the low hum of a room full of people exhaling and shifting and turning to the person next to them to say, "Did you see that? Did you feel that? Is she okay? She's incredible. I've never seen anything like that on this show." In the center of it all, Johnny Carson and Carrie Fisher sat facing each other in the sudden privacy that a commercial break creates, that strange suspended moment when you are surrounded by hundreds of people and somehow completely alone. Carrie Fisher reached into the small pocket of her dress. She took out the folded cocktail napkin, the one she had written on alone in the green room. She held it for a moment. Then she slid it across the desk to Johnny. He unfolded it. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically. Johnny Carson had too much control for that, but something moved through his eyes, something that looked like recognition. On the napkin, in Carrie Fisher's handwriting, were two words: "Help me." Not a joke, not a reference to Princess Leia's famous message, not a performance. Just the truest thing she had felt in years, written down in a moment of honesty so quiet and private that she had almost convinced herself she would throw it away before anyone saw it. She hadn't thrown it away. She had given it to Johnny Carson. Johnny looked at her for a long moment. He set the napkin down carefully, as though it were fragile. "Okay," he said quietly. "Just that. Just one word." But Carrie Fisher later wrote that it was the first time in as long as she could remember that she felt heard. The cameras came back. The interview resumed. To anyone watching at home, the next 12 minutes looked like more of the same: brilliant, funny, electric Carrie Fisher and the legendary Johnny Carson trading stories and landing jokes. But something was different. Something had shifted. A door had opened, just a crack, that had been sealed for a very long time. And what happened after the camera stopped rolling, after the audience filed out, after the studio lights went down, is the part of this story that Carrie Fisher carried with her for 40 years. A conversation that never made it to air, a promise made between two people who understood more about public loneliness than almost anyone alive, and a single moment, quiet, private, without cameras, that Carrie Fisher later said was the beginning of her finding her way back to herself. The Tonight Show wrapped at 7:12 in the evening. The audience filed out into the warm California night. The crew began striking equipment. Ed McMahon went to find a phone. Doc Severinsen packed his trumpet. Johnny Carson walked to Carrie Fisher's dressing room and knocked. She opened the door. She had taken off her earrings. Her public face was beginning to come down. You could see it in the set of her shoulders, the slight sag of the performance. "Got a few minutes?" Johnny asked. She had a few minutes. What they talked about for the next 40 minutes has been described in partial accounts by people who were there, a makeup artist who heard fragments, an assistant who brought coffee and was waved gently away. The full conversation was private, but the shape of it has been reconstructed from things Carrie Fisher said in interviews over the following decades, and from a passage in her memoir, Wishful Drinking, where she wrote about a conversation with a television host in 1983 that she described as the first time I understood that being honest about struggling was not the same thing as failing. Johnny Carson had struggled too. This is something he almost never said publicly. The persona he had built, cool, controlled, unflappable, endlessly competent, was a performance as carefully constructed as any Princess Leia had been. Behind it was a man who had been married and divorced multiple times, who described himself as fundamentally uncomfortable in social situations, who hosted the most-watched show in America, and then went home to a kind of solitude that he found both necessary and sometimes crushing. He didn't tell Carrie all of this, but he told her enough. He told her that the performance was real, the talent, the joy, the genuine connection, but that the performance was not the whole person, and that somewhere along the way the two things had to be separated or the whole enterprise collapsed. He told her that asking for help was not a weakness. It was the only rational response to being human. He told her that she was 26 years old and she had time. Carrie Fisher listened. She did not cry, though she came close. She held her coffee cup with both hands, and she listened to a man who had been doing this for 30 years tell her that it was survivable, that the distance between who you are in public and who you are in private was not permanent, was not destiny, was not the rest of her life. When she left NBC Studios that night, she called her doctor. Not immediately, it took a few weeks. It took a few more conversations, a few more dark nights, a few more moments of writing 2 true words on a cocktail napkin and then being brave enough to hand them to someone. But the night of July 29, 1983, was where the direction changed. That was the night someone asked. What happened in the years that followed is part of the public record, and it is extraordinary. Carrie Fisher entered treatment for substance dependency in 1985. It was one of the hardest things she ever did, and she said so loudly, publicly, without apology, at a time when celebrities simply did not discuss such things. She was one of the first major stars to speak openly about addiction and mental health, decades before it became commonplace, decades before the language existed in mainstream culture to have those conversations without shame. She wrote Postcards from the Edge, a semi-autobiographical novel about a young woman in Hollywood navigating addiction, fame, and the complicated love between a performer mother and performer daughter. It became a bestseller. It became a film. It became, for millions of people who recognized themselves in its pages, a kind of lifeline. She became one of the most beloved public voices in conversations about mental health. She spoke about her bipolar disorder diagnosis, which came later, in the late 1980s, with a directness and humor that destigmatized the conversation for countless people. She was funny about it. She was fierce about it. She was, in the truest sense of the word, honest about it. And she always said that honesty had to start somewhere, that there was a moment or a series of moments when you stopped performing the version of yourself that the world found comfortable and started saying the true things, even when the true things were small and private and written on a cocktail napkin and slid across a late-night television desk. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992 after 30 years. In the months after his retirement, he gave a small number of interviews, fewer than almost anyone expected, given the magnitude of his career. He was intensely private in ways that had always defined him. In one of those interviews, he was asked which guest had surprised him most in 30 years. He paused for a long time. There was a young woman, he said, very famous, very funny. She came on the show when she was at the top of everything, and she handed me a note. He paused again. I've thought about that note a lot over the years. He did not name her. He never did, not publicly. But people who knew him say that he kept a small collection of mementos from the Tonight Show years. Not the Emmy Awards, not the photographs with presidents, small things, personal things. Among them, according to his longtime producer Fred DeCordova, was a folded cocktail napkin. This is what 40 years looks like when it starts with 2 honest words on a piece of paper. This is what happens when someone asks, really asks, and someone else is brave enough to answer. Carrie Fisher became one of the most important voices of her generation, not because she played a princess, not because she wrote brilliant, hilarious books, but because she was willing to tell the truth about being human in public, at a time when that was genuinely radical. And it started in a green room in Burbank, California, with a woman who was tired of making the difficulty look easy, and a man who leaned forward and said 4 words, "So I'm asking." Carrie Fisher died on December 27, 2016. She was 60 years old. The outpouring that followed was unlike almost anything in recent cultural memory, not because she was Princess Leia, though that mattered enormously, but because of what she had done in the decades since 1983. Because of the books, the speeches, the interviews, the frank and funny and devastating honesty about being a human being who happened to be famous, who happened to have a complicated brain, who happened to find healing in the act of saying true things out loud. Millions of people who had never met her wrote about how her words had saved them, had helped them seek treatment, had helped them tell someone they were struggling, had given them language for things they had felt but couldn't name. The note she handed Johnny Carson in 1983 said, "Help me." The life she built after that moment said to everyone who needed to hear it, "You can ask too." Johnny Carson was asked about Carrie Fisher after her death. He had died in January 2005, 11 years before her, so he couldn't answer the question directly. But his longtime friend and colleague had this to say: Johnny always said that the guests who stayed with him weren't the ones who were most polished. They were the ones who were most real. Carrie Fisher was, behind the wit and the performance, one of the most real people who ever sat in that chair. The Tonight Show desk where she slid that napkin across to Johnny Carson is in storage somewhere in NBC's archives. The napkin is gone. But what it started is not. This is what I want you to take from this story tonight. Fame is a performance. Success is a performance. Confidence, quite often, is a performance. And there is nothing wrong with any of that. Performance is how we survive, how we connect, how we build lives in public. But underneath every performance is a real person who gets tired, who gets lost, who sometimes sits alone in a green room staring at their reflection and writes 2 honest words on a cocktail napkin. Carrie Fisher was 26 years old, the most famous young woman on earth, surrounded by hundreds of people, and she was lonely in a way that success had made somehow harder to see. Johnny Carson asked, and she answered, "That is the whole story. That is also the instruction. Ask the people in your life how they are, really ask." The way Johnny asked, with patience and silence and genuine willingness to hear the answer. And when someone asks you, really asks you, be brave enough to tell the truth. You don't have to be Carrie Fisher. You don't have to be famous or funny or brilliant. You just have to be honest with someone once. The rest tends to follow. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories like this one, stories about the moments behind the moments, the conversations that changed lives, the nights that nobody remembers quite right except for the people who were actually there. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be tired of making the difficulty look easy, someone who needs to know that it is okay to slide a note across the desk. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about a moment when someone really asked and it made all the difference. Because those moments are everywhere. They happen every day, and they deserve to be remembered.